The gates of Kiev have shattered. The air is thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. Mongol tumans pour through the breach, a tide of leather and steel, moving with a terrifying industrial efficiency. The strong are chained for labor. The skilled are segregated for transport to Karakorum. The rest are put to the sword. But amidst this precise calculus of slaughter, a strange transaction occurs. A warrior, his blade slick with blood, confronts a black-robed monk. The monk, clutching a wooden cross, prepares for martyrdom. The warrior pauses, looks not at the man, but at the symbol. He snarls and shoves the priest aside. He is left untouched. This was not mercy. It was policy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together of the Mongol Empire. To understand this moment of conspicuous clemency, we must first analyze the brutal system it defied. The Mongol methodology of conquest was not chaotic rage. It was a form of demographic engineering. When a city resisted, its population was sorted with the cold logic of an accountant. Artisans, blacksmiths, fletchers, jewelers, and weavers were identified and cataloged. They became the property of the Khan, a human resource to be deported to the Mongol heartland or distributed among the Noyans, the military aristocracy. Young women and strong men were bound as chattel slaves, their value measured in raw physical utility for labor or breeding. The remaining population, the useless, were often systematically executed. This was not simply cruelty for its own sake. It was a calculated act of terror, a message in blood sent to the next city on the line: submit or cease to exist. Into this brutal arithmetic steps the clergyman. Whether a Russian Orthodox priest in Ryazan, a Nestorian Christian in Samarkand, a Taoist sage, or a Buddhist monk in Tangut territory, the accounts from primary sources are remarkably consistent. From the secret history of the Mongols to the chronicles of the defeated, like the Novgorod Chronicle, and the reports of European travelers, a unique status is noted. They were, almost universally, spared execution. This clemency was not born of spontaneous respect or a sudden fit of conscience. It was a foundational legal principle, encoded in the great Yasa of Genghis Khan. The Yasa was the supreme law of the empire, a code that bound every warrior and general. And one of its most critical and strategically brilliant provisions was the explicit exemption of religious leaders, scholars, and physicians from both taxation and, crucially, the sword. To understand why, we must divest ourselves of modern conceptions of secularism. The Mongols, and Genghis Khan in particular, were not atheists, nor were they monotheists demanding conversion. They were, in the main, followers of Tengri, the eternal blue sky. Their worldview was one of profound spiritual pragmatism. They believed that all powerful gods existed and that all heavens were, in essence, one. To kill a holy man, any holy man, was to risk offending that man's God. It was, simply, bad spiritual business. When we consult the records, such as the observations of Giovanni da Pian del Carpini, the papal envoy who traveled to the Mongol court, we see this in practice. Carpini noted with some astonishment that the Khans offered reverence to all faiths. They invited Nestorian priests, Buddhist monks, and Muslim imams to their courts, demanding only one thing: that they pray for the Khan's health and the success of the empire. Sparing the clergy of a conquered land was a form of spiritual insurance. It neutralized a potential divine enemy and sought to co-opt that god's power for the Khan's own benefit. The Yasa was, in this sense, a legal firewall against supernatural retribution. But the Yasa was more than superstition. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare and social control. Genghis Khan and his successors understood that to rule a vast, multi-ethnic empire, you did not simply break the bodies of the conquered, you had to manage their souls. Killing a city's priests and monks achieves nothing but the creation of martyrs. It fuels hopeless, fanatical resistance. It destroys the very social fabric that the Mongols intended to use. A dead priest cannot preach submission. A burned monastery cannot be taxed. A shattered religious hierarchy cannot be used to count and control the survivors. And so, the warrior shoves the priest aside. The monk in Kiev, the imam in Bukhara, they are left alive. But this act of mercy is the sound of a different kind of lock clicking shut. They are not being set free. They are being reclassified. They have been spared the sword only to be harnessed to the machinery of the Pax Mongolica. Their survival was not an oversight. It was the first step in their conscription. They were no longer just spiritual leaders. They were now unwitting assets of the Khanate, tools of administration, and the designated shepherds of a captive flock. Their chain would not be iron, but one of legal obligation, state-sanctioned authority, and profound, binding dependence. This binding dependence was not a haphazard arrangement. It was a codified legal status. The cage was not built of iron bars, but of parchment, ink, and the crushing weight of imperial law. The monk, the priest, or the imam, spared the blade, was immediately absorbed into the Mongol administrative matrix. Their freedom was, in fact, a carefully defined and revocable privilege. When we examine the primary sources, particularly the records of the Golden Horde in its relationship with the Rus's principalities, this system is laid bare. The key legal instrument was the Yarlik, a formal decree or charter issued by the Khan. These Yarliks are some of the most fascinating documents of the era, a perfect fusion of nomadic law and sophisticated imperial administration. Upon swearing fealty, the head of the church, for example, the Metropolitan of Kiev, would receive a Yarlik from the Khan in Sarai. This document granted the church and all its personnel a status known as Tarkhan. This was the legal mechanism of the gilded cage. What did Tarkhan's status entail? First, it confirmed the Yasa's exemption. The Yarlik explicitly stated that priests, monks, and their immediate families were immune from execution and enslavement. But it went much further. They were exempted from all forms of taxation. They did not pay the karash, the poll tax levied on every other soul. They were exempt from the yam, the grueling postal relay service that requisitioned horses and supplies from the populace. They were not subject to military conscription. Even the church's lands and properties were declared inviolate. To any outside observer, this would appear to be an act of profound religious tolerance, even benevolence. This is one of the most persistent myths of the Mongol Empire. But when we, as historical analysts, deconstruct the legal language of the Yarliks, we find the quid pro quo. The contract was explicit. In exchange for this sweeping protection, the clergy had two non-negotiable duties. The first was spiritual. They were commanded to pray for the Great Khan. They were to use their sacred rituals, their access to their God, to petition for the Khan's long life, his health, and most critically, the victory of his armies. To a modern secular mind, this might seem symbolic. To the Mongols, it was anything but. They were conscripting the spiritual power of every god into the service of the empire. Refusal was not heresy. It was treason, punishable by the instant revocation of the Yarlik, and, with it, the priest's life. The second duty was purely administrative. The Yarlik transformed the clergy into the new bureaucratic middle management of the conquered state. We must visualize the human experience of this. Imagine a town in the Ryazan Principality decimated by the invasion. The prince is dead, his druzhina, war band, shattered. The civil authority has evaporated. The only structure left standing, both literally and figuratively, is the church. The only recognized leader left alive is the priest. Into this power vacuum steps the Mongol Baskak, the regional governor and tax collector. He does not speak the language. He does not know the people. He holds the authority of the sword, but he needs a local mechanism to count and control the survivors. He summons the priest. The priest, clutching his yarlik, or perhaps wearing a paisa, a Mongol tablet of authority, around his neck, is the only man who can bridge this gap. He is safe. His family is safe. But that safety is now contingent on his absolute cooperation. His first task, social control. He must stand before his terrified, grieving congregation and preach submission. He must convey the Khan's will, that resistance is futile, that the new order is absolute, and that obedience is the only path to survival. The chroniclers record the bitter anguish of this role. The clergy, the traditional shepherds of the people, were now legally bound to calm the flock for the wolf. Any hint of encouraging resistance, any word of rebellion spoken from the pulpit, would void the Tarkhan status and bring the Tumans down upon them. His second task was even more insidious: tax collection. The Mongol system of tribute was famously thorough. It was a census-based poll tax. Every soul owed a tithe, paid in silver, fur, or labor. But how does a Baskak count a scattered, hidden, and hostile population? He doesn't. He delegates. The church, with its meticulous parish records of births, baptisms, and deaths, was the only institution possessing a comprehensive demographic database. The clergy became the de facto census takers for the Golden Horde. The priest, once the recorder of souls for God, was now the accountant of heads for the Khan. He was required to produce accurate lists of his parishioners so that the Baskak's agents could extract the dan, tribute, with maximum efficiency. This leads us to the greater economic function. The Tarkhan status protected not just the priests, but church property. While the lands of the secular boyars were seized, broken up, and redistributed, the vast estates of the monasteries were left untouched. In fact, they grew. We see in the records a massive flight of capital into the church. A terrified peasant or a minor noble, knowing his own land was forfeit, would donate it to a local monastery. Why? because that land would then fall under the Yarlik's umbrella of tax exemption. The monastery's wealth swelled, its land holdings ballooning during the yoke. The Mongols permitted this. They were not fools. They were patient investors. They understood that a looted monastery yields wealth only once. A functioning, wealthy, and protected monastery becomes a reliable, long-term source of revenue. The monastery could farm its vast new lands, brew its ale, manage its fisheries, and sell its goods in markets now secured by the Pax Mongolica. This created a massive, tax-sheltered economic engine. And while the church itself was exempt, it was still expected to provide gifts and voluntary contributions to the Khan. More importantly, it managed the population that was taxable. It was, in modern terms, a state-sponsored corporation given a monopoly in exchange for laundering imperial control. This system was a masterpiece of legal and social engineering. It repurposed the conquered people's most trusted institution into a tool of its own oppression. It harnessed the profound moral authority of the clergy and turned it into a political anesthetic, dulling the pain of subjugation and encouraging compliance. When we compare this to other systems of servitude, its uniqueness becomes clear. This was not the chattel slavery of the field hand, nor the military servitude of the nukur. It was a formally institutional servitude. The priest in his gilded cage was perhaps one of the most effective and most tragically compromised figures in the entire Mongol apparatus. He was safe, he was respected, and he was utterly, completely bound to the machinery of the Khanate. He walked free, but his soul was in chains. The great irony of the Mongol yoke is that the very system designed for permanent control became the incubator for its eventual dissolution. The Khans were master strategists, but they made a profound and ultimately fatal miscalculation. They believed that by exempting the clergy, they were merely neutralizing a threat and co-opting a bureaucracy. What they failed to comprehend was that they were not just protecting priests, they were protecting an idea. While the secular Rus's principalities were deliberately played against one another, their princes forced to journey to Sarai to humiliate themselves for the Yarlik, the patent of authority, the church remained the only unified institution in all the Russias. The metropolitan of Kiev, later of Vladimir, and then Moscow, was the one man who spoke for the entire shattered civilization. The Khans had, in their quest for administrative efficiency, reinforced the authority of the single voice that could one day speak against them. This created a dangerous, lopsided power structure. The political world of the Rus was a fractured, collaborationist landscape. The spiritual world, in contrast, was a consolidated, protected, and increasingly wealthy monolith. When we analyze the economic data from this period, the consequences become stark. As discussed, the Tarkhan status of the monasteries made them tax-free havens. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, as secular lands were ravaged by Mongol tribute collectors and internal princely squabbles, the church's wealth grew exponentially. Terrified nobles and peasants donated their land, their silver, and their furs to the monasteries, placing their worldly goods under the only insurance policy that mattered, the Khan's own Yarlik. Monasteries like the Trinity Lavra outside Moscow, or the Monastery of the Caves in Kiev, became more than spiritual centers. They became the de facto national banks of a non-existent nation. They were vast storehouses of capital, protected by Mongol law, and run by the only educated, literate class left intact. They were also the guardians of the chronicles, the keepers of history. While the princes were forced to be pragmatic collaborators, the monks in their cells were writing the narrative of martyrdom, suffering, and the godless yoke. They were preserving the cultural memory, the very idea of Rus, for a future generation that might be strong enough to act on it. For over a century, this system functioned exactly as the Mongols intended. The church preached submission, it assisted in the census, and its leaders were loyal subjects of the Khan. But in the latter half of the 14th century, two things changed. First, the Golden Horde itself began to fracture, weakened by internal civil wars. Second, a new generation of Rus's princes arose in the ascendant city of Moscow. Princes who had never known a world before the yoke, and who were less intimidated by it. The pivotal figure is Dmitri, the Grand Prince of Moscow. He began to entertain the unthinkable, open, organized military resistance, but he could not do this alone. His political authority was limited. He needed a moral, spiritual, and financial partner. He needed the church. Here, the narrative crystallizes in a single, semi-legendary encounter. Before marching against the armies of the Khan Mamai, Dmitri Donskoy journeyed to the Trinity Lavra to seek the blessing of its founder, Sergius of Radonej. This moment is the pivot on which the history of the yoke turns. We must analyze what was truly happening. Dmitri, a secular prince, was visiting a monastery, an institution that owed its very existence and immense wealth to the Tarkhan privileges granted by the Khans. He was asking its leader, a man legally bound to pray for the Khan, to sanction a war against him. Sergius's blessing was an act of profound, revolutionary significance. It was the church, the Mongols' own protected asset, officially retracting its spiritual sanction for the Khan's rule. It was a declaration that the Yarlik was no longer a binding contract, but a chain to be broken. Sergius, according to the chronicles, not only blessed Dmitri, but also famously released two monks, former warriors, to join his army, a symbolic gesture that the church was now committing its physical and moral force to the rebellion. This act transformed the coming conflict. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380 was not just one prince's dispute over tribute. It was reframed as a holy war. It was a crusade for the Orthodox faith against the infidel. The church, using the very authority the Mongols had protected, provided the moral justification, the national narrative, and likely a significant portion of the financial backing for the war. The battle itself was a brutal, bloody victory for the Rus, and while it did not end the yoke, the Mongols would return and burn Moscow 2 years later. It shattered the myth of their invincibility. It proved that resistance was possible. In the century that followed, the alliance between the Muscovite state and the Orthodox Church became the engine of liberation. The Church provided the ideology of Moscow as the Third Rome, the successor to Constantinople. It provided the unified cultural identity that transcended petty principalities. And the monasteries, with their vast, protected wealth, provided the economic stability to fund the final, standing on the Ugra River in 1480, the event that finally threw off the Khan's chains. The Mongols, in their brilliant, pragmatic legalism, had created their own gravediggers. By sparing the clergy, they had sought to tame the soul of Rus. But that soul was not a pragmatic, pluralistic Tengriist spirit. It was an exclusive, monotheistic faith that saw the world in terms of divine truth and godless error. The Yasa was a tool of administration. The cross was a weapon of ideology. They had protected the one institution that could never, in the long run, truly be their subject. They built a gilded cage for the clergy, only to find they had forged an untouchable fortress for the very idea of the nation they had tried to erase. They were the unwitting architects of their own demise. The Mongol Empire, a system built on pragmatic law and overwhelming force, proved mortal. It could chain bodies, levy taxes, and shatter armies. But in its calculated decision to spare the soul of the lands it conquered, it sealed its own fate. For it is in these protected spaces, in the quiet of the monastery and the light of the altar, that the memory of a nation was kept safe, biding its time and waiting with absolute patience for the chains to rust.